I'm going to talk to you about this morning is Kansas manufacturing. Kansas is a manufacturing state. It is a big part of our economy. What's happening in manufacturing has the ability to influence all other parts of the economy. So it's important to understand what our manufacturing environment looks like. The information that I'm going to be talking about actually comes from the annual survey of manufacturers. It's kind of an unusual data set that we don't frequently look at, but it has a lot of detailed and in-depth information. It comes from the Census Bureau. So every 5 years, the Census Bureau does a comprehensive survey of manufacturing from the U.S. economic census. It covers 300,000 establishments. It's a very detailed survey and very expensive to do, so they only do it every 5 years. In between years, they do what we're going to be looking at today, which is the annual survey of manufacturers. It's a much smaller survey. Only covers about 50,000 establishments, but it does give us a snapshot of what's been going on in this very important industry in the interim 4 years in between the economic censuses. It just kind of gives us an idea of what's going on in the manufacturing environment. It's a high-level survey. It's not going to tell us in detail what's going on with any specific business, but it can tell us what that environment looks like that those businesses are making decisions within. So it can be pretty interesting stuff. It gives us a more detailed look than we are usually accustomed to being able to look at. So the first shot from the manufacturing survey we're going to look at is total manufacturing altogether. So when we look at this, what we see is manufacturing in Kansas has had a slight decrease in employment and increase in wages. On this quadrant graph, when we see the bubble that is kind of in the upper left-hand corner, that's what that's showing us. Employment growth is slightly down and wage growth is slightly up. That would generally tell us that there is a shortage of workers. Their supply of workers is not good to the manufacturing industry right now. If we saw a bubble more up in the upper right-hand corner, that's increasing employment, increasing wages, strong demand for workers. And then if we see a bubble down in the lower right-hand corner, increasing employment and decreasing wages, an increase in the supply of workers. So as I move through this is kind of the detail that we're going to be looking at. What general manufacturing looks like right now gives us this bubble right here in the middle. Slightly decreasing employment, slightly increasing wages. But this survey will allow us, this data set allows us to break that down into more detailed information. Well, the first thing that we're going to look at then is by industry. Overall in Kansas, there's about 160,000 manufacturing workers. Like I said, a big chunk of our economy statewide. That falls down into some key industry. Aerospace and animal processing being the two biggest ones. Ag machinery, manufacturing, HVAC equipment, rubber products. Each one of these, about 2,000 or more employees, all the way up to aerospace with 32,000 employees. The number of the residents of our state that are working in these industries and the business environment of these industries matters to them. So the first thing that we're going to do is break it down by industry. And when we look at that on the same bubble graph, we see that there is some interesting things happening in manufacturing. It's not all just low wage growth, low employment, or slightly decreasing employment growth. We look at animal food manufacturing and industrial machinery manufacturing. Although the employment levels in those two industries aren't as large as animal processing and aerospace, there's actually employment growth and wage increase in animal food manufacturing and industrial machinery. There's employment growth in HVAC equipment, although employment growth with decreasing wages would generally tell us that HVAC equipment has a decent supply of workers, would be one story. Another thing that could be happening there would be that they are hiring workers. Older workers that are generally at a higher wage rate are retiring. That's bringing down the average wage rate. But there's good positive things happening in animal food manufacturing, industrial machinery manufacturing, and HV equipment manufacturing. The reason why when we see the overall information on manufacturing in total, it's attributed to our major industries, animal processing and aerospace. That's what they're looking like in that area. One of the bits of detail that we can get out of the manufacturing survey that we don't get in other surveys is actually the ability to break this information down between production workers and non-production workers, a closer look. So when we start to look at employment and wages across the state in manufacturing, and we look at non-production workers that are working in the manufacturing industry, so these are our office workers, our design, our engineer, our marketing, all of those roles. When we look at this graph, manufacturing in Kansas is growing. There is hiring happening in these industries, not in production workers, but in non-production workers. And in some of these industries, non-production workers are a significant portion of employment. Industrial machinery manufacturing, this light one right here, 55% of the workers in industrial machinery manufacturing are non-production workers. Only 45% work in production industry. Agricultural and manufacturing, this one right here, 32% of the workers in that industry are non-production workers. And they've hired a lot of non-production workers in that area. Even when you look at our larger industries, aerospace manufacturing has 31% non-production workers, a lot of design and engineering and aerospace manufacturing. Animal slaughtering, fairly few production workers, only about 11% of those, but they are hiring in that industry. So when we look at manufacturing in total, we see the light wage growth and employment declines, but when we look at it from a non-production, there's actually growth in some industries and growth in non-production workers in most industries. Then we can turn around and look at the production workers themselves. We still see good growth in animal food, industrial, and HVAC. And we see these 5 industries over here that show us when we're seeing the low wages and the employment declines in manufacturing, we're really talking about these 5 industries. Wage declines and employment growth, pretty much flat wages in aerospace with employment declines, and upward pressure on wages and large declines in ag construction, machinery manufacturing. These are the industries that we're talking about when we don't see a lot of growth in manufacturing. So if we drill down a little closer into these industries, and we look at actually what's happening. In aerospace, tank manufacturing, and rubber product manufacturing, we're seeing upward pressure on hours worked. The workers that they have are working more hours. Strong indication that the reason why we're not seeing employment growth in those industries is that there is a shortage of workers. To get those industries growing more strongly, they need more workers. They're working the workers that they have more hours. If they could find more workers, they would likely hire them. That's not necessarily the case in animal slaughtering and ag production. We don't see a strong employment growth in either one of those industries, and we're seeing a decrease in hours. Okay, not the case with these other industries. So if we look at those 2 industries a little more closely, and we look at the productivity of each worker within those industries per hour, we see in animal slaughtering and processing, they're not working their workers more hours, but the hours that the workers are working, they are much more productive. They've had almost a 15% increase in productivity. Likely that the story in that case is they're getting more efficient. There's been new capital improvements, there's been other investments in the industry that have allowed them to be more productive with the workers that they're having. So we're seeing stagnant wages and growth in employment in those industries, not because their industry is suffering in any way, but because the workers that they have are getting more productive, and that's actually a good thing. Agricultural machinery production, on the other hand, has had a decrease in productivity. When I think back a couple slides ago, we look at that is also the industry that had the largest increase in non-production workers. It's likely that there's been some significant management changes in those industries, and sometimes that can decrease productivity for a short period of time over those industries. So when we look at manufacturing in Kansas as a whole, we don't see a lot of employment growth or wage growth, but that's not the true story. There's a lot more detail available in there. We're seeing strong growth in animal production, industrial machinery, and HVAC equipment. We're also seeing growth in non-production workers across most industries. It's not that the industries are not growing, it's that when we look at the high-level data, what we're seeing is no employment growth in the production workers of some of our major industries, aerospace, shipping container, and rubber products. But even within those industries are working the employees that they have been able to find more hours, indicating there's probably a shortage of workers. And we've also seen a strong increase in productivity in animal processing, why we would have the shortage of workers in that area. So there's a little bit more to say about manufacturing in Kansas other than just slow employment growth. There's a lot of good positive things going on that are being masked in the high-level data. That's one of the reasons why we like this survey. It allows us to drill down into more detail and actually see what's going on at a finer level. Okay. Anyone have any questions?
So while we're waiting for questions, I mean, so you made a couple comments I think that are interesting. I mean, one comment is that there's a shortage of workers, and in one case, and in some communities on the call here, and again to remind everyone, we have part of this Kansas Economic Outlook team. We have Pittsburgh, Salina, Hayes, Emporia, and Dodge, and a lot of these communities, you know, their shortage of workers is very different than the rest of the state. I mean, some of them is just there's not a lot of labor available. And that's one storyline where there really isn't people available and there's this aging workforce. But then another story is also that there are people available, they just don't have the right skills for what the companies are wanting. So it's one or both, perhaps, for a lot of these communities, and that might be something that you guys want to talk about. I found it also interesting, you said that animal slaughtering, I think it was maybe 2 meetings ago or 3 meetings ago at one point, maybe Joanne Knight or someone brought up that in the animal slaughtering, there had been a lot of technology improvements in the, I think it was the distribution side and packaging side of the companies. And Joanne might want to talk about some of how that has changed over the last few years. What questions are there out there? Or comments? Observations?
Jeremy.
Yes, who's this? I heard someone say my name, but I'm not sure who that was. Was that Joanne or? Yeah. Can you get a little closer to the mic? It's really hard to hear you. All right, I can barely hear you. Is there a way to send a chat message or? All right, if she can get her microphone or be able to send in a chat box, which I am monitoring, we can do that. Any other questions or comments from the group?
Okay, I'll add one. This is Mark Fusaro from Emporia. I noticed that the largest category on the first slide was the other category. So as you dig down into the deeper levels, where does other sit? I mean, which quadrant do they sit in? I know it's hard to interpret it because we can't envision which industries it is. But since it is such a large portion of the overall picture, it'd be good to see, I mean, does it look like the industries that you showed us, or is it different from the industries that you showed us?
I haven't looked at all of them, but I've looked at a lot of the smaller categories that are closely related to some of the larger categories. So we've drilled down into animal food processing and to those categories, and there is a lot of variation. I think the large employment industries where we see some growth and some contraction is very representative of some of those smaller industries. There is other smaller pockets of growth that don't involve as much employment, but it's still there. With this type of survey, when we get down into those lower employment industries, the margins of error also get quite large. So we haven't spent a lot of time, but I've run my eyes over it, and there is, my general interpretation is across Kansas there is a broad range of activity. It's when we lump manufacturing all together into one, we're covering up a lot of things that show variance in what's happening in the industries, and I believe that applies all the way down through some of the smaller, lower employment industries that we didn't cover in this presentation.
Yeah, we have a few those sectors that are not that dominant, you know, when you look at total size, but have a really unique history to Kansas. So if you look at paper, box manufacturing, and things like that, there's several companies that have ties to Hallmark in the state, and they're struggling today trying to figure out how to transition those industries into something a little bit more productive. But then we have other ones that are doing really high-end consumer goods like high-end boats and motorcycles and things like that are expanding with wages. But I'm talking more at a business level than industry level. So yeah, it does differ. It's very different across the state. Joanne wrote in and said that they did have the $50 million expansion at Cargill and a $30 million at National Beef, both adding the investment to the distribution side. And as I recall,
Jeremy,
yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, I called in on the phone. I don't know why I couldn't get in on my computer, but yeah, we've had both companies that are just recently finished that. Cargill did cut back on about 300 employees. They went from 2,650 down to 2,350. Because there's basically one person running that whole distribution side. And the reason for those investments is so that they could get into the Japanese and Korean markets better with smaller packages, as well as they can just tell the computer that this box needs, you know, one ribeye, one this, one that, instead of having to send out cases of the same product. And so National's finishing up 30 million on that now, but they have actually added employees. They're up to 2,950 now, and they also have just purchased land to do another expansion. But both companies are typically about 100 employees short at any given time just because of turnover. So they're continually hiring still.